Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of the Carolina Haints Podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Throughout the history of mankind, gold has always been one of the most sought after and prized minerals on Earth. And for nearly as long, it has been associated with crime, greed, and murder. So is it any wonder that North Carolina's first gold mine was the setting of an apparent murder? One where the cries of its unfortunate victim still echoes through the dark, underground passages. In 1799, a 12-year-old boy named Conrad Reed found a shiny rock on his family's farm in Cabarrus County. The family used the rock as a doorstop for a few years until John Reed, the boy's father, decided to show it to a jeweler. The rock, as it turned out, was a 17-pound solid gold nugget. Not understanding the value of gold, Reed sold the rock to the jeweler for $3.50. It was valued at the time to be worth $3,600. Thus began America's first gold rush. By the time that the much larger California gold rush was struck in 1849, most of North Carolina's gold resources had been depleted. But what was left behind were hundreds of skilled and experienced workers. These men migrated to California, and the success of California's gold rush can directly be traced to the North Carolina workforce. Oh, and don't feel too sorry for John Reed. Within a week of selling that first nugget, John had a small mountain of gold sitting in his barn. The creek that ran through the property was littered with it, many of them larger than the 17-pound rock he had sold. Having learned from his mistake, he invested in large-scale mining on his farmland. Until gold was struck in California, Cabarrus County led the nation in gold production, and John Reed deposited over 2,500 ounces of gold before the mine ceased operation. Although John Reed passed away in 1845, the mine continued to operate until 1912. The Reed Gold Mine is still open to tours in Midland, North Carolina. As its name suggests, Gold Hill, North Carolina, is another North Carolina gold rush boomtown. Today, the town of Gold Hill is a sleepy little village a few miles away from both Midland and Concord. Only the superstructure of the old Gold Hill mine reminds you that 175 years ago, the streets of the town were teeming with people. Most of the town's residents worked at the gold mine, and with that many people in such a small town, some of them were bound to dislike each other. And so it was with Stan Kukla and Aaron Klein. They both worked in the mine. They were polar opposites of one another, and they didn't like each other very much. Well, to be more accurate, Big Stan was a bully who had a favorite target, Aaron Klein. Stan berated Aaron because of his size. Aaron was a skinny kid, barely 20 years old, while Big Stan, as everyone called him, was a mountain of a man. Stan also taunted Aaron because of his religion. Aaron was the son of a Jewish rabbi. Stan insulted Aaron about his age and experience in the mine, but perhaps the primary source of their animosity was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl named Elizabeth Moyle, who they both had eyes for. I don't know about you, but I'm reminded of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Anyways, Aaron hated working in the mine. He was originally from Pennsylvania, but after both his parents died, he was stuck in between. At just 20 years old, he was no longer a boy, but neither was he quite yet a man. He had very little worldly experience, so he traveled south like thousands of others, looking to make a quick buck working in the gold mines of North Carolina. It was not what he expected. Aaron hated the dark, dirty confines of the mine. He hated that it was hard to breathe down there, and he especially hated the mine entrance. The Randolph shaft was an 850-foot vertical shaft straight down into the earth. At the beginning and end of each shift, the miners would load themselves into the skip, which is something like an elevator car with no sides to it, as it noisily creaked and groaned, taking the men straight down into the bowels of the earth. Several different shafts branched off from this main tunnel. The last several feet of the shaft extended below the level of the bottom and collected the rainwater that fell into the shaft so that the tunnels themselves didn't flood. Big Stan was an older Cornish man who, when he wasn't working in the mine, spent most of his time in the town drinking hole, the Nugget Saloon. At the beginning of December 1842, Big Stan and a group of coworkers are at the Nugget drinking. As they leave, Stan takes the rest of the bottle of whiskey with him. Outside, Aaron is sitting in front of one of the other nearby shop fronts. When he sees Stan come out of the bar, he tries to slink away unnoticed. But of course, Stan sees him. Stan, never one to pass up on an opportunity to insult Aaron or make an anti-Semitic remark, made a beeline for the smaller man. He mocked Aaron, asking if the Jew boy would like a drink. When Aaron does not reply, Stan reaches out with his meaty hands and grabs him by the back of his neck. Still holding the whiskey bottle in his other hand, he proceeds to force the liquid down Aaron's throat. Aaron twists and struggles to break free from Stan's grip. He runs inside the store. As he does, Stan taunts him. "See?" he says. "She doesn't want a sick little puppy. She wants a real man." As it turns out, Big Stan was wrong. A week later, he learned that Elizabeth and Aaron were set to marry on Christmas Eve. For Aaron, things were finally looking up. He still hated the mine, but each day of work brought him closer to the day he would marry his beautiful bride. Not to mention the fact that working the mine was relatively lucrative. Aaron had been saving his money, and after they married, the couple planned to move back up north to Pennsylvania. Many of his fellow miners would lightheartedly pick on the young man about his upcoming nuptials. But not Big Stan. Stan grew uncharacteristically quiet during those few weeks. And whenever he would hear one of the other miners picking on Aaron, his face would redden. One evening, just before the wedding, Aaron returned home late to his cabin, having had to run some errands after work in preparation for the wedding. A few days before, he had bought a puppy for Elizabeth, but he had not yet given it to her. However, the cabin was empty. After searching in all the corners of the tiny shack, Aaron figured he must have found a way outside. He began looking for the little dog around the tightly packed miner's cabin where he lived. He was about to give up the search when he heard a small dog yelp in a short distance away. He immediately rushed to where he thought the sound had come from, but found nothing. Then he heard another short bark. He headed off in that direction. It appeared as if the dog was going toward the mine. Arriving at the mine, Aaron found the lifeless body of the poor, defenseless puppy lying next to the 850-foot Randolph shaft. Its skull had been crushed. Aaron was probably too confused and distraught at the sight to register the heavy footsteps that came barreling toward him from behind. The next day, when Aaron didn't show up for work, some of his co-workers grew worried. Others joked that perhaps he had gotten cold feet and ran off in the middle of the night. Perhaps at the end of his shift, Big Stan Kukla paused before getting onto the elevator to stare into the dark rainwater beneath the elevator car. After work, the following day, Elizabeth's father implored the miners to form a search party. Big Stan jumped at the opportunity and volunteered to lead the search. They walked for miles, searching the woods and fields surrounding Gold Hill, but of course, they hadn't found a trace of Aaron Klein. After several days of exhaustive searching, nearly everyone had come to the belief that Aaron had simply ran away. Stan expected the body to surface at the bottom of the pit once decomposition set in and the body began developing internal gases. But Aaron's body was never found. A couple months later, people began seeing a ball of light near the entrance to the mine. The light would always travel from the mine entrance toward the miner's shack a short distance away. Some of the miners returning home after dark reported that the light would dart up to them before retreating a few feet, and then repeat the pattern. Some also claimed that a sound accompanied the light, much like the whimpering of a young puppy. After a while, most of the miners figured there must be some sort of reasonable explanation for the lights, but just ignored them. Except for Stan, who could be heard mumbling repeatedly to himself about ghosts. Even though the mining business was lucrative for its employee, Big Stan, he was greedy. Even before he pushed Aaron Klein to his death, Stan would sneak into the mine at night and pocket some extra gold for himself. He generally stayed in the upper level shafts because it was less likely his midnight mining would be noticed in those tunnels. After Aaron died, Stan would occasionally see a light far off in the distance, down in the tunnels with him. At first he was alarmed, thinking that someone had caught him stealing in the mine. But when no one confronted him, he went about his business, grumbling about ghosts and Aaron Klein. He didn't see the light every night, but on those nights when the light showed up, it seemed a bit closer each time. As the following December rolled around, marking the 1-year anniversary of Aaron Klein's death, the light showed up again. Big Stan began to remember as he realized that the light was right behind him. He kept working, doing his best to ignore the light, hoping it would just go away. Finally, not being able to resist any further, Big Stan turns toward the light. He could not stifle his scream as there in front of him was Aaron Klein's mangled face, still dripping wet from the rainwater at the bottom of the shaft, and wearing a miner's light. Stan pushes past the apparition and sprints back toward the skip. When he reaches the main shaft, he is running too fast to realize that the skip is not there. Somehow, the noisy skip had been lowered all the way to the bottom of the mine without him hearing it. Unable to arrest his momentum, he plummeted to the base of the shaft, landing on the metal bed of the skip. The following morning, when the miners arrived at the mine for work, they were surprised that the skip was not at ground level. They ran it all the way up to find the twisted body of Big Stan. Stories of the mysterious light of the Gold Hill mine would persist for several years, until finally fading out of history around the time of the Civil War. The mine closed in 1918, but 100 years after Aaron Klein's death, a second ghost story started circulating about the old Gold Hill mine. One evening, 2 men witnessed a shocking apparition near the entrance of the mine. The grisly haunt was in pieces, each appendage floating in midair around the torso and the disembodied head. Each of the body parts seemed to glow from within. Suddenly, the ghostly man becomes aware of the men watching him and turns to face them. As he does, they hear a sharp sound like the cracking of a whip, and the apparition vanished. According to the men, they recognized the man as Joe Newman, who had died several years ago when a huge explosion had leveled his house, with him inside. Although the explosion was deemed suspicious, the authorities could not find any evidence of foul play. Joe and his brother, Walter George Newman, owned the Gold Hill mine. Most locals believed that Walter had arranged the explosion in order to gain full control of the mine for himself. The skeletal superstructure of the Gold Hill mine still stands at the site of the old mine. For more information on this story, check out Daniel Barefoot's North Carolina's Haunted 100 Volume 2, Piedmont Phantoms. Also check out Nancy Roberts' North Carolina Ghosts and Legends. You can visit the Reed Gold Mine in Midland to experience an old tunnel mine for yourself. I can say from experience, it's not only a creepy thing to do, but it's a neat way to get cool during the hot summer months. This episode was researched and written by Jeff Cochran, and is narrated and produced by me, Dan Sellers. If you enjoyed the show, please feel free to check out all our other projects. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Rick Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. You can find every episode of our show and everything else that we're up to at our website, rickhavocproductions.com. You can stream every episode of this show at carolinahanks.com, and you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Google Play, and soon we'll be on iHeartRadio and Stitcher. Don't forget to check out darkerworld.com for updates on Jeff Cochran's work, and feel free to email us your suggestions and queries at rickhavocproductions@gmail.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.